Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Leadership Development Office radio show and podcast, where we tap into our colleagues' experience with leadership in our organization. My name is Matthew Painter. I'm the Director of Leadership Development in the Leadership Development Office, and I will serve as your host along with my very esteemed co-host, Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Heider, and I'm a Senior Consultant for Leadership Development in the Leadership Development Office. And we're really excited to be joined by a fantastic guest today who is an expert in the performance management topics that we will be discussing, Toni Leeth. Toni, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I don't know that I've introduced myself as an expert in performance management, but I'll go with it. So I'm Toni Leeth, Associate Dean for Strategic Planning and Administration in the Medical School here at UAB, and I'm also Executive Administrator for Medical Education. And I know that sounds very vague and amorphous, and I think it's probably intentional. It means I get to pick up a lot of fun projects along the way. But yeah, delighted to be with you guys here today.
Yeah, so Toni, you might be modest around not being an expert in performance management, but with anybody with your level of experience has had to deal with performance. And on some level, everything that we do is performance management, right? Before we get into that topic though, I'm just curious, I'd like to hear just from you, as you reflect back on all your experiences as a leader, what's a lesson learned that you could share with our audience?
Oh gosh, there's so many, right? When you think about this, and we've talked about this before, how we have to be intentional to reflect, because these experiences, they teach us how to be better leaders, and only if we allow them to. So one for me is to be intentional about leadership. And there was a book that I read called Leading with Intention by Mindy Hall that has stuck with me. And there are a lot of learnings out of that, but several of them were around being very thoughtful with every interaction. And of course, I read that with don't be lazy. Like, don't miss the opportunity to ensure that we've, used that interaction with any individual, even if that's every meeting that we have, one-on-one or in a group meeting, that I've prepared for it. I've been thoughtful to use that opportunity to inspire others to action, to articulate goals and expectations, but just to be present and be intentional. And that does play a lot into performance management, right? Because you're talking about building teams and nurturing teams. And if you're not intentional, it doesn't happen. Those aren't things that happen just by happenstance.
That's fantastic, and it really seems to underlie what I'm hearing from you is the importance of building relationships through those interactions. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Oh, absolutely. So when I think about building a team, there are some fundamental pieces of that for me, and one of those is relationships. You have to know people. You have to invest in people. And if you don't demonstrate to them that you value them for who they are and what they bring to this team, and that is equally as important as anybody else on that team, you're not going to draw the best out of them. And they're not going to want to stay. So to do that, you have to know them. And know them not just for the skill sets that they bring and put on a resume, that contribute to the organization, but sometimes we miss the intangibles that people bring to the team that are as important. We were just talking about a team that we're working with, and I was doing rounding on each member as we transition from one big part of the project to the next big part. And one of the leaders on the team, he's our informatics leader. And of course, you would acknowledge the skills that he brings in that space. But there are two other big pieces that he brings to the team uniquely. And one of them is his gift at levity. So when you're working on projects, especially really intense projects, you need someone who can lighten the group a bit. And he has a gift at doing that. That isn't, it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like it just got thrown in or goofy, but it's natural and just feels very genuine. And the other thing that he brings to the group is that he is very good to identify when we start to go out of bounds and start to go out of scope. And so he'll raise the flag a bit on that, and not in a aggressive way, but like, well, wait a minute. Or now we are supposed to be doing this. So is that really, does this line up to that? So I think you have to spend the time both in relationships to get to know those people and know those assets, so that when you build teams, you ensure you bring those pieces to the table too, but also that you nurture and encourage that so they feel comfortable to bring those pieces to the table. And to know that we're all people, right? So outside of the time that you spend in that office or on that team, you go home to whatever that looks like for you. And to know that that same person I just talked about, you know, has a passion for building and he built on his farm, he built a barn for his wife's horses because she loves horses. And to know that about people, it shows that you care. And I know, you know, I think so many times as leaders, we build our leadership style a lot based on what we've been exposed to.
Yeah.
So I think about the things that have drawn out the best in me, and it's when people have taken the time to know me and get to know me, and they ask those questions, and I know that they care about me.
So how does that interface, that relationship building, does that play into being able to set expectations of people that you're working with? And how do you set those expectations for performance?
So in terms of this relationship and the things you get to know about people, does that play in? I think that it does, for a couple of reasons. One, you need to know what are their aspirations, personally and professionally. And that's part of getting to know somebody. So that needs to show up in expectation setting, because so much of this is how do you grow? How do you leverage those things you're really good at? But how do you help establish and develop those things? Ooh, just broke that. That's going to be helpful. Hey, what do you do?
I love it.
Yeah. So you have to draw those things out. And if you don't include those in your expectations, I mean, people aren't widgets. I mean, so you have to bring into, you know, aspects of this, what's important for them, so that you're going to draw out the best in them. So I think about that when I think about expectations and how those relationships that you've established come into play with that. In terms of setting expectations, that is so critical. Everything that I work with, I think you absolutely have to start with setting clear expectations, but you do that together, right? So if I've had buy-in to developing the expectations for myself and for the team, I'm so much more likely to, you know, contribute to that and meet those expectations, right? So I think that that's anytime you start you have a new team member who joins, you do that and you have that conversation. I did this with a group that I brought in recently and did one-on-ones with them, and said, my kind of thing going into each one of those was, you know, we judge each experience on how well it met our expectations. I'm not clairvoyant. I can't know what your expectations are of this experience. So I need you to tell me. And likewise, I will share with you my expectations, both of you in this role, but also for this team and how we're going to work together to accomplish this. And so establishing that at the front gives opportunity for them to voice their desires and expectations of the experience, whether that's a position that you've hired them into, or it's a team experience, a project. And then continually throughout, because things do change. And so you want the broad expectations, but I've learned, don't be very vague about what your expectations are. Don't leave people guessing. You know, again, going back to where have I thrived? I've thrived when people tell me what they expect of me, and then communicate if I've met that or not, right? If I'm left in a guessing game, it really isn't helpful for them or for me.
So I love all these things that you're talking about. I mean, I love the relationship building piece of it, the shared expectations and so forth. And you made a superb case for doing all of that. Can you just walk us through, like, you've communicated the value, but I'd like to hear what your strategy is for actually doing it.
Sure. So usually I think about the role very specifically. And so I actually even do this in job descriptions. There are two pieces when I think about with expectations. There's the tangible, like what is it specifically? What's that deliverable? But I also talk about it in terms of quality and value, right? So what are my expectations in communication? And so I've broken those two pieces out. I break them out in the position description that I post, and I go through that with the individual as well. Because this is the culture and the value that we expect of anybody on this team. What's your time? What's the expectation of your communication back to us? What's that frequency and response? What's that look like for how you engage with other people in terms of respectful and value to other people? So I break those two pieces out when I do that and sit down with them at the beginning and talk about those things. But I do, like I said, I go into it asking them what their expectations are. Well, what does this look like for you? What are the things that you want to grow out of this experience? Where do you see yourself? What are the things the experiences that you want to take into this? So that's how I approach doing expectation setting in the beginning and then throughout a project. Again, like I said, just because I don't want to leave people guessing what that looks like. And then we write it out and I communicate it back to the person after we've met as a follow-up to say, this is what I heard, that expectations for you, expectations from me for you, and then what we'll do moving forward.
So
I think that level of clarity is so fantastic and so absolutely necessary, because both of you need to understand what expectations you're trying to fulfill before there's any hope of fulfilling them. And that's a fantastic insight. I'm wondering if you can speak to how talent development intersects with performance management on your teams.
Well, if you're not developing your people, they're not going to perform as well for you. I mean, their two are so inextricably linked, if I can say that correctly. So I think talent development is actively happening, but it always has to be a part of performance. As I mentioned earlier, right, you're drawing out as part of that expectation. How do you want to grow? What are your aspirations? What do you want out of this experience? Likewise, when you do performance management, you set goals, and you be intentional to set goals that also draw and develop that individual. So that's both personally and professionally. So is this a strength that is this particular strength that I'm trying to grow and nurture even more? If it's leadership or public speaking, or it's, it could be talent management if I have a team beneath me. So I think those are things that you have to articulate throughout with the person on your team. The other thing that I think of with this is, I've had team members before where you ask that question, let's talk about goals. What particular goals would you have for this next year? Well, I really, I would love to fill in the blank. And it's things that have absolutely nothing to do with the scope of their role, right? And that's wonderful. However, when I do talent management and performance evaluation, I link them back to what's the mutual benefit for you and for the organization, right? So your role here, we want to see you grow into your capacity within this role. So let's identify things that take you to the next step, right? So that you can take on more responsibility, you can grow within the scope of your role. I don't know that if I walked in and said, I'd really like to become a better photographer, that would be something that they would encourage me to do as a part of my job responsibility. I may want to do that, but I would be hopefully directed to things that relate more specifically to my scope and my role. But I do always ask the individual to identify those at first, because that tells me a lot about them, both how willing they are to stretch themselves, what new opportunities they want to take in the future. So I start with them, but we do ensure that it has mutual benefit to the organization and to the individual. And then I think an important piece of that sometimes we forget is when we've invested in people and we've helped them grow, we need to figure out a way to engage that new skill set if that's an expansion of their responsibility, if there's opportunity to do that. But even if it's not an expansion of responsibility, we'll put them on a project that lets them, play in that space and further hone that skill set. And it benefits the organization as well. So don't develop people if you have no intention to giving them opportunity to grow.
That's fascinating, Toni. I'm also curious to kind of piggyback off of this line of thinking around talent development, around mentoring. And like, I'd like to hear about like any mentors that you've had, but also like how you approach or see mentoring working in your department and the purpose and value that that brings.
Oh, that's a good question. I've had a lot of different mentors along the way. Some that have been within a specific space, and I don't think that one mentor solves all things for you. I used to work on a leadership institute for about 10 years and was one that really advocated for mentoring teams, because I think that one person can't have line of sight over everything and is not going to be that expert in that all of those things where you need to grow as a leader. And I think it helps you to have multiple people that can show you those blind spots and help you to really develop in that spot, in those places. In the work environment, I do encourage mentorship. It can be a little bit harder, especially if those are people in your same space, right? Because is this mentorship? Is it coaching for employment growth? What is this, right? But I think as an individual, you need to seek out all of those things. So people on my team, for example, I don't miss the opportunity to coach. I think that's part of my job as their leader, is to provide coaching opportunities. It's a little different than necessarily just feedback related to their role. You're coaching and encouraging on things that may be outside of that. And certainly, I would say they probably fall a lot in the line of those value sets that we talked earlier, and coaching in that way. But mentorship as well for specific areas of growth, and especially professional growth. So I don't know that I'm really answering your question, except to say, yes, mentorship is terribly important, but you also have people who will advocate for you that don't necessarily serve as a mentor, that will, you've built relationship with, you've demonstrated, and at times you may call on them to be an advocate for you for a new opportunity, or to speak on your behalf. So it goes back to Laura's question about relationships. You're constantly, those relationships are critical for you to demonstrate where you've grown and see things that you don't get to see, and also to help you with identifying that next step and push you a little bit. And we all need that.
Absolutely. So like, would you say that no matter what level of leadership that you'd acquired, you still could benefit from a mentor, or do you think there's a point at which you no longer need one?
Oh, we're always learning, because the environment around us is not static. And if you're working with people, it never is static, right? No one person is the same as another. So you're constantly growing as a leader. If you ever think that you stop growing or you stop needing mentorship, then that's a blind spot right there. No, I think, and I do think that there are people that, in the past have maybe thought I shouldn't get a coach, I shouldn't have a mentor, because that's seen as a sign of weakness. I don't know. And I think culturally that's changed a lot. It's highly encouraged to have mentorship throughout your career. It actually speaks highly of you if you seek that out, because you're willing to acknowledge that I don't have it all figured out. I'm always growing, and I need somebody that can help me see those spaces that maybe I don't always see. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of value in that. And doing so with mentors who maybe aren't so embedded in the area that you're in. They get that unbiased view, right? I had a work encounter that just frustrated me. And I was talking to one of my mentors about it, and she laughed And I was like, why are you laughing? And she said, Toni, tell me again what your Enneagram is. Oh yeah. I should have seen how I react to this, right? So it's that sometimes it's right there staring at you, and they can be so helpful for drawing out those things and reminding you, okay, yeah, I would react that way. Now, what do I do about that? So it's so helpful with continuing to grow your self-awareness too.
I love that. That's so meaty and absolutely true in my experience as well.
It's almost like mentors can serve as a good mirror for us too. It's a good sounding board, good mirror for us. I think the last thing I want to kind of dive into, I know that, Toni, you've worked very closely with the Leadership Development Office in terms of developing leadership competencies. So I'm curious to hear, how you see that being a value add or not towards performance management, and what, how we might use that.
Oh gosh, yeah. So one of the aspects of my role in the dean's office is for recruiting senior leadership for the School of Medicine. That tends to be department chairs, people in a dean's role. And it gets to more of, these are leadership roles, right? So different than how many papers have I published, how many grants have I written, et cetera. There's a demonstration of leadership that is necessary to be successful in those roles. And so I look at the competencies as defining what are those pieces that are so necessary to be successful. And if we haven't done the right job on that, then you could potentially put someone in a role who is not going to be successful. And that's not fair to them, and it's not fair to the organization. That's where we haven't done our job. So the competencies help us define very clearly for that role what's necessary for that person to be successful. And also, when we think about developing people, and there's a fundamental set for at a certain level of an organization that this is your core set of leadership competencies. And as you grow within an organization, those competencies also grow. There are other things that you have to take on that you wouldn't necessarily in another role. So it also helps us in identifying how to develop people for further growth in leadership. So that okay, this is the next building block for you. Now we're going to focus on this aspect, whether it's, political acumen or it's talent management, things that you just add to your tool belt. And doing so, and not just saying, I did it, I took that class, I'm good. No, you continue to hone those leadership competencies. But that all helps us develop a strong leadership team to serve the organization. But if you've never done that homework to identify those for your organization, both specific for your culture, but also for those leadership levels, then you're potentially setting people up for failure. And it goes back to your point earlier around expectations and setting them, right? These are expectations we have, and if we didn't vocalize them, and leadership competencies give us a way to vocalize them and also measure them, it sets that person up for success, and it helps us ensure that our expectations were met.
Excellent. Toni, you are clearly a wealth of information, so much so that we're going to have to bring you back for part 2, and we're going to dive into the topic of accountability and feedback. So I hope all of our listeners will tune in for our second part of this session when we talk to Toni about those topics. So thank you again for joining in.
Thank you. I look forward to it.